The mess hall echoed with a chorus of metal utensils scraping against trays as the Italian prisoners filed in, their bodies still tense from the journey across the Atlantic. Sergeant Paolo Bianchi paused at the entrance, his nostrils flaring at an unfamiliar aroma, rich, savory, unlike anything he had smelled since before the war began. Behind him, other prisoners whispered nervously, their eyes darting to the American guards, who stood casually along the walls, rifles held loosely, faces expressionless beneath their helmets. "Avanti, avanti," muttered the man behind Paolo, giving him a gentle push forward. The line shuffled toward the serving counter, where American kitchen staff in white aprons waited with large metal spoons and ladles poised over steaming trays. As Paolo approached, he held out his metal tray, expecting the watery soup and stale bread that had been standard fare since his capture in North Africa. Instead, the server dropped a thick, juicy slab of beef onto his plate, followed by a mound of fluffy potatoes and fresh vegetables. The meat sizzled slightly, pink in the center, a trail of juice seeping across the tray. Paolo stared in disbelief, certain there must be some mistake. "A can de vera?" he whispered to himself, wondering if his eyes were deceiving him. Was this actual beef in a prison camp? He moved forward mechanically, accepting a roll of white bread so soft it yielded beneath his fingers, unlike the rock-hard loaves they'd subsisted on during the campaign. At the end of the line, an American soldier nodded toward the tables, a half-smile playing at the corner of his mouth as he watched the Italian's stunned expression. Paolo found a seat among his fellow captives, many of whom were already cutting into their steaks with the provided utensils, actual metal knives that no one seemed concerned might become weapons. Beside him, Lieutenant Marco Rossi, once an architecture student in Milan, stared at his plate as if it might suddenly vanish. "They must be trying to impress us for some reason," Marco murmured, his fork hovering hesitantly over the meat. "Perhaps American officials are visiting today." Paolo cut into his steak, watching as the juices pooled beneath it. When was the last time he had tasted real beef? Before Sicily, certainly. Maybe before the war itself. He raised a small piece to his mouth, half expecting it to be taken away before he could taste it. What kind of nation feeds its prisoners like kings while its own soldiers fight overseas? The question lingered in his mind as the first bite melted on his tongue, unleashing a flood of memories from before the world had descended into madness. The steak was only the beginning. What came next would challenge everything these men believed about their captors, about America, and about the war they had been fighting. 3 weeks earlier, Paolo and his comrades had huddled in the darkness of a transport ship's hold, their bodies swaying with each roll of the waves. Rumors spread like fever through the cramped quarters. America was a land of gangsters and slums, they whispered. Prisoners were worked to death in factories or sent to scorching deserts to die of thirst. These stories had been repeated by their officers, reinforced by newsreels and propaganda pamphlets since Mussolini's declaration of war against the United States in December of 1941. "My cousin's friend was in the Merchant Marine before the war," whispered Corporal Domenico Ricci, his thin face appearing skeletal in the dim light filtering through the hatch. "He said Americans live in filth, that half their cities are controlled by criminal syndicates, and most of them can barely afford to eat." The others nodded solemnly. They had all heard similar tales of depression-ravaged cities, of unemployment and soup lines, of a nation without culture or history. These were the stories that had comforted them during the fighting in North Africa, the belief that their enemy, though numerous, was fundamentally weak. The ship docked at Newport News, Virginia, on a misty morning in September 1943. As they marched down the gangplank under armed guard, the prisoners braced themselves for mistreatment, for the harsh retribution that surely awaited defeated enemies. Instead, they found themselves loaded onto clean, modern trains with padded seats and windows that opened to admit the breeze. American soldiers distributed water and sandwiches, actual meat between slices of soft bread during the journey inland. Paolo remembered clutching his sandwich in disbelief, staring at the slice of ham visible between layers of fresh bread. Around him, his comrades ate silently, embarrassed by their hunger, yet unable to resist the offering. Outside the windows, the landscape rolled by. Not the bombed-out ruins and blackened fields they knew from Europe, but intact farms, orderly towns, paved roads with automobiles moving freely despite the war. "Guarda," whispered Marco, pointing through the window as they passed a small town. "Look at the shops. Look at the people." Paolo pressed his face to the glass, watching women in colorful dresses strolling along sidewalks, children playing in parks, stores with full display windows. There were no bomb craters, no ruins, no obvious signs of rationing or hardship. America, 3,000 miles from the fighting, seemed untouched by the war that had consumed Europe. When they arrived at Camp Atterbury in Indiana, the men filed off the train, expecting to find the harsh conditions they had been warned about. Instead, they discovered wooden barracks with real beds, indoor plumbing, hot and cold running water, and electricity in every building. Each man received a complete set of clothing appropriate for the climate, toiletries, and even cigarettes. And then came that first meal in the mess hall, the steak that now sat half-eaten on Paolo's tray as he struggled to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had been told to expect. The prisoner beside him, a farmer from Sicily named Antonio, broke the silence. "My family in Palermo has been eating polenta and whatever vegetables we can grow for 2 years," he said, his voice low and tinged with disbelief. "And here, in an American prison camp, they feed us better than I ate at my own wedding." Paolo nodded, unable to formulate a response as he cut another piece of steak. The American guards showed no sign that this meal was special or unusual. They simply watched, occasionally exchanging words or laughing among themselves, treating the moment as utterly ordinary. And that, perhaps, was the most disorienting realization of all, that this abundance, this casual display of plenty, was not exceptional in America. It was simply how things were. What did it mean for the war, for Italy, for all they had been told, if their enemies lived in such prosperity that even prisoners ate like this? The question hung unspoken in the air as the men finished their meals, unsure whether to feel grateful or disturbed by what this first taste of America revealed. And as Paolo would soon learn, the steaks were not a welcome feast or a singular event. They were just the first glimpse into a reality that would fundamentally challenge everything he thought he knew about the war and the enemy he had been fighting. The routine of camp life gradually revealed that the first meal had not been an aberration. Breakfast brought eggs, real eggs, not the powdered substitutes that had become standard in Italy, along with bacon, toast with butter and jam, and fresh milk. Lunch featured sandwiches bulging with meats and cheeses, soups rich with vegetables and chicken, and fruits that many of the men hadn't seen in years. And dinner, night after night, included meat, sometimes steak, other times chicken, pork chops, or roast beef, always accompanied by vegetables, bread, and dessert. Paolo found himself standing before the shower one morning, watching steam rise from the stall, still unable to fully accept that hot water flowed freely here, available whenever he wished to use it. In Sicily, his unit had gone weeks without proper washing facilities, using helmets of cold water to rinse away the worst of the dust and sweat. Here, soap and hot water were available daily, along with fresh towels and clean clothes. "It makes no sense," muttered Corporal Ritchie as he stepped from an adjacent shower, reaching for his towel. "They tell us America is suffering, that their economy is weak, that their soldiers are soft. Yet look around. Even their prisoners live better than our officers at the front." Paolo nodded, watching water swirl down the drain. The abundance was unsettling, challenging the very foundation of what they had been taught about their enemy. If Americans could supply this level of comfort to prisoners while simultaneously fighting wars across 2 oceans, what did that say about their industrial might, about the war itself? In the barracks that evening, as the men sat on their beds writing letters home or playing cards, Paolo overheard snippets of conversation that revealed he wasn't alone in his confusion. One group discussed the meat they had been served, trying to calculate how many Italian families could be fed from what was routinely provided to prisoners in a single meal. "My mother writes that in Naples, they line up for 5 hours to buy a few ounces of horse meat," said a young private named Luca. Here, they throw away more food after one meal than my family sees in a week." Others nodded in solemn agreement. The waste was perhaps the most shocking aspect of all. Seeing kitchen workers casually discard leftovers that would have been precious treasure back home. Some prisoners had taken to keeping bread rolls in their pockets, unable to bear seeing food thrown away, even when they weren't hungry. One evening, Paulo found himself assigned to kitchen duty alongside several other prisoners. The American mess sergeant, a broad-shouldered man named Jenkins, showed them around the facility with surprising patience, demonstrating how the industrial-sized stoves, refrigerators, and mixers operated. The kitchen was spotless, gleaming with stainless steel and white tile, more modern than any restaurant Paulo had seen in Naples before the war. "We feed about 500 men here, 3 meals a day," Jenkins explained through an interpreter, gesturing to the massive stock pots and ovens. "Everything according to regulated nutritional standards." Paulo translated this for the others, watching their expressions as they tried to comprehend the scale of the operation. The walk-in refrigerator stood open, revealing hanging sides of beef, crates of fresh vegetables, milk in glass bottles, and eggs by the hundreds. One prisoner, a former butcher from Rome, reached out to touch a side of beef, then pulled his hand back as if burned. "Ask him," the butcher said to Paulo, nodding toward Jenkins. "Ask him if this is normal. Ask if all Americans eat like this." When Paulo translated the question, Jenkins looked momentarily confused, then laughed. This is standard army mess hall fare, nothing special. Back home, people eat better than this." The interpreter relayed these words, and a heavy silence fell over the Italian prisoners. Paulo watched as his comrades' faces registered the implications. If this abundance, this casual wealth of food that seemed miraculous to them, was considered ordinary, even somewhat inadequate by American standards, what did that reveal about the true balance of power in this war? Later, as they worked alongside the American kitchen staff, Paulo observed another disturbing reality. The men they were working with weren't special elite troops or officers. They were ordinary soldiers, many from humble backgrounds. A cook named Miller mentioned growing up on a farm in Iowa. Another spoke of his father's hardware store in Pennsylvania. These weren't aristocrats or the wealthy elite. They were common men who nonetheless took for granted a standard of living that seemed luxurious to the Italians. "In my town," Miller told Paulo through the interpreter as they worked side by side peeling potatoes, "my mom still sends me packages with homemade cookies and canned goods, even though I keep telling her I get plenty to eat in the army." He laughed, shaking his head. "She doesn't believe the food here is good enough for her boy." Paulo nodded, thinking of his own mother in the small village outside Naples, who had been making soup from vegetable peels and bread from coarse flour mixed with ground chestnuts when he last saw her. The contrast was too stark to contemplate without a sense of growing unease. That night, lying on his bunk beneath clean sheets and a warm blanket, Paulo stared at the ceiling, turning these observations over in his mind. The America they were experiencing bore no resemblance to the desperate, chaotic nation they had been told about. If their leaders had been so wrong about this, what else might they have been wrong about? The question felt dangerous, bordering on treasonous, yet impossible to ignore. And as the days passed, the evidence of American plenty only continued to mount, forcing Paulo and his comrades to confront realities far more complex than the simple narratives they had been given about their enemies and the war itself. "They're coming to take pictures today," announced Marco one morning as the men prepared for breakfast. "American journalists to document the camp." Paulo straightened his shirt, wondering what propaganda purpose such photographs might serve. Would they be presented as evidence of American kindness, or would the images be manipulated to suggest harsh conditions? Either way, he found himself curiously invested in how they would appear. When the small group of reporters arrived, accompanied by camp officers, the prisoners were eating their breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast with real butter, coffee with milk and sugar. The journalists moved through the mess hall, snapping photographs and speaking to a few prisoners through interpreters. Paolo watched their faces, searching for signs of the ulterior motives he suspected, but saw only professional curiosity. One reporter, a woman with short dark hair and a camera hanging from her neck, approached Paolo's table. Through an interpreter, she asked about conditions in the camp and how they compared to what the men had expected. "We eat better here than I did in the Italian army," Paolo replied cautiously, unsure whether honesty was wise. "There is plenty of food, clean quarters, medical care." The interpreter translated, and the reporter nodded, making notes in a small book. "And how does this compare to what you were told about America before you came?" she asked. Paolo hesitated, glancing at his comrades. Marco gave an almost imperceptible shrug, a gesture that seemed to say, "What does it matter now?" "We were told Americans were starving," Paolo said finally, "that your economy had collapsed, that your cities were filled with unemployed people, that your army was weak because your men were soft and undisciplined." When these words were translated, the reporter's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't seem offended or surprised. She simply nodded and made more notes. "And now?" she prompted. Paolo gestured to the plates before them, the remains of eggs and bacon, the empty glasses that had contained fresh milk. "Now we see something different," he said simply. After the journalists left, the prisoners discussed the encounter among themselves. Some worried they had said too much, that admitting their changed perceptions might be seen as betrayal. Others argued that it hardly mattered. They were already prisoners, and the reality of America was becoming impossible to deny, regardless of what they said or didn't say. "My brother is still fighting with what remains of our forces," said Antonio, his voice low. "He still believes what we were told. Should I tell him in my letters about the steaks, the eggs, the clean sheets, or would that be cruel?" It was a question many struggled with as they wrote carefully worded letters home, trying to navigate between honesty and the knowledge that their words would be censored, and that the truth of their experience might be painful for loved ones still enduring wartime hardships in Italy. How could they explain that they, as prisoners, were living better than their families? That defeat, ironically, brought them to a land of plenty, while victory had proven elusive and costly for those at home? As autumn progressed, bringing cooler weather to Indiana, the camp routine expanded to include work details. Some prisoners were assigned to nearby farms, harvesting crops under guard, but in conditions far more pleasant than they had anticipated. Others worked in camp maintenance or in various workshops. The labor was reasonable, never excessive, and always compensated with canteen credits that could be used to purchase additional cigarettes, snacks, or personal items. Paolo found himself assigned to a nearby vegetable farm, where he worked alongside other prisoners harvesting tomatoes, corn, and squash. The American farmer, a man named Miller with weathered skin and strong hands, worked alongside them, sometimes pausing to demonstrate techniques or to share water and sandwiches during breaks. One afternoon, as they loaded crates of tomatoes onto a truck, Miller asked through an interpreter about farming methods in Italy. Paolo described his father's small plot outside Naples, where they had grown olives, grapes, and vegetables on terraced hillsides, backbreaking work that yielded modest harvests. Miller nodded thoughtfully, then gestured to the surrounding fields that stretched to the horizon. "My family has farmed this land for 3 generations," the interpreter translated. "Nearly 1,000 acres now. We supply vegetables to the army and to markets in Indianapolis." Paolo translated this for the other Italians, watching their expressions shift as they processed the scale. 1,000 acres for a single family farm, when many of their families worked plots of 2 or 3 acres back home. The American farmer didn't boast. He simply stated facts that revealed volumes about the different worlds they inhabited. During lunch, Miller's wife brought out additional food: homemade bread, cold chicken, pickles, and a chocolate cake that left the prisoners in stunned silence. She served them as if they were guests rather than enemy prisoners, her manner matter-of-fact rather than condescending or forced. "My son is in the Pacific," she said as she poured lemonade into cups. "I like to think someone might be kind to him if he's captured." The simple statement hung in the air as the men ate, confronting them with a perspective they hadn't considered. that their captors might see them not merely as enemies, but as sons and brothers caught in the same terrible machinery of war that had claimed their own loved ones. It was a humanity they hadn't expected, another piece of evidence that contradicted the dehumanized portraits of Americans they had been shown. Back at camp that evening, Paulo found himself struggling to reconcile these experiences with his identity as an Italian soldier. Was it disloyal to acknowledge the prosperity he witnessed? To question the depictions of America that had been drilled into them? Or was it simply honest to recognize reality when confronted with it so undeniably? He wasn't alone in this moral crisis. Throughout the camp, prisoners were grappling with similar questions. Some responded by doubling down on their nationalism, insisting that American abundance was somehow illegitimate or would prove fleeting. Others found their convictions crumbling in the face of daily evidence that contradicted everything they had been told. "Perhaps we are the lucky ones," Marco said quietly one evening as they sat outside their barracks, watching the sunset paint the Indiana sky in shades of orange and purple, "to see the truth with our own eyes, rather than to die believing lies." Paulo nodded, understanding the complex mix of emotions behind the statement. Relief at their relative safety, guilt over the comforts they enjoyed while comrades and family still suffered, and the unsettling sense that they had been pawns in a game whose true nature they were only beginning to comprehend. What did it mean to discover that your enemy was not who you thought they were? That their strength came not from brutality or corruption, but from a prosperity so deep it extended even to their prisoners? These questions haunted the men as they moved through days marked by the steady rhythm of abundant meals, clean quarters, and work that never crossed the line into exploitation. And as winter approached, bringing holidays and new challenges, the contrasts would only grow sharper, forcing confrontations with truths more personal and profound than any they had yet faced. The mess hall was transformed for Thanksgiving, a holiday the Italian prisoners had never heard of before their capture. American staff had decorated the tables with paper turkeys and cornucopias, and the meal itself defied description. Roast turkey with stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes with gravy, sweet potatoes, green beans, and pumpkin pie with whipped cream. The prisoners ate in a state of disbelief, watching as seconds and even thirds were offered casually, as if such abundance were normal even in wartime. Captain Thomas Reeves, the camp commander, addressed the men briefly before the meal through an interpreter. "This is an American tradition of giving thanks for our blessings," he explained. "While you are far from your homes and families, we wish to share this tradition with you and assure you that efforts continue toward peace and your eventual return to your loved ones." The speech was met with respectful silence, followed by murmurs as the interpreter finished. For many of the prisoners, it was the explicit acknowledgement of their humanity, the recognition that they too had homes and families they missed, that proved most surprising. They had been prepared for dehumanization, for treatment as faceless enemies. Instead, they found themselves included in an American tradition, served a feast that many American civilians would have envied. That evening, as the men gathered in the recreation hall where they were permitted to socialize, play cards, or write letters, the conversation inevitably turned to the meal and what it represented. "My cousin writes from Milan that they had no meat for Christmas last year," said Ricci, his face solemn. "Here, for a holiday we've never even heard of, we eat like kings." Paulo nodded, remembering his last Christmas at home in 1942. The small orange shared among 5 people, the single small chicken that had been a rare luxury. The contrast with today's casual abundance was almost painful to contemplate. An older prisoner named Giuseppe, who had been a history teacher in civilian life, spoke up. "What we're seeing is the difference between nations mobilized for war," he said thoughtfully. "Italy, Germany, all of Europe has been consumed by it. Everything is directed toward the war effort, and civilians bear the burden through rationing and shortages. But America," he gestured around the warm, well-lit room, "America produces so much that even with rationing, even while supplying not just their own forces, but the British and Russians, they still have enough to feed prisoners like this." His words hung in the air as the men considered their implications. If America could fight a two-front war across thousands of miles of ocean while still maintaining this level of abundance, how could Italy, smaller, less industrialized, with fewer resources, have ever hoped to defeat such a power? The question was too uncomfortable to voice directly, touching as it did on the fundamental choices that had led Italy into the war. Instead, the conversation shifted to more immediate concerns: letters from home, news of the war's progress, carefully filtered through official channels, and plans for Christmas, which the camp administrators had promised would be observed with special meals and even small gifts from aid organizations. As winter settled over Indiana, bringing snow that transformed the camp into a landscape many of the southern Italians had never experienced, another revelation awaited them. The barracks were heated, not marginally to prevent freezing, but to a level of consistent comfort that allowed the men to wear shirt sleeves indoors despite the snow piling against the windows outside. One evening, Paolo found himself in the camp infirmary with a mild case of bronchitis. The American doctor examined him thoroughly, listened to his lungs with a stethoscope, and prescribed medicines that arrived within hours. He was given a clean bed in a warm room, served chicken soup and tea with honey, and checked on regularly by medical staff. In Sicily, he told Marco, who had come to visit him, half our unit had respiratory infections for weeks. The medics had few supplies, and only the seriously ill received real attention. Here, they treat a simple cough as if it matters. Marco nodded, sitting beside the bed. Lieutenant Belli told me that in Germany, prisoners are working 12-hour shifts in factories. In Japan, Allied prisoners are starving. He lowered his voice. We drew the winning lottery ticket, Paolo. Capture by Americans. It was true, Paolo realized. Their defeat had, paradoxically, delivered them to safety and comfort, while their comrades, who had escaped capture, continued to face danger, privation, and death. The irony was bitter, laced with guilt and the unsettling awareness that their good fortune came at the price of their nation's defeat. As the weeks passed, this awareness settled into the prisoners' consciousness, reshaping their understanding of the war and their place in it. They learned from carefully worded letters that conditions in Italy were deteriorating as the Allied advance pushed northward. They heard rumors of German occupation in the north, of civil war between fascists and partisans. Meanwhile, they lived in heated barracks, ate 3 substantial meals daily, received medical care, and worked reasonable hours for fair compensation. The contrast was most stark at mealtimes, which continued to feature meat daily, often beef, sometimes pork or chicken, occasionally fish. For men from a culture that prized food as a centerpiece of family life and identity, these meals were not merely sustenance, but powerful symbols of America's difference from the world they had known. My mother would weep if she could see this, said Antonio one evening, staring at his plate of roast beef, potatoes, and vegetables. Not from hunger, but from the knowledge that such plenty exists in the world while her family has so little. Others nodded in solemn agreement. The abundance they witnessed daily had ceased to be merely surprising. It had become a lens through which they re-examined everything they had been told about the war, about America, and about the decisions that had aligned Italy with Germany against such a formidable power. As Christmas approached, the camp buzzed with preparation. American staff hung decorations, a tree appeared in the recreation hall, and rumors circulated about special foods and activities planned for the holiday. For many of the prisoners, it would be the second Christmas away from home, but the first in circumstances that allowed for genuine celebration, rather than mere survival. The Christmas Eve meal surpassed even Thanksgiving. Roast beef and turkey, multiple side dishes, wine, a small glass per prisoner, strictly regulated, and an array of desserts that left the men in stunned silence. Afterward, a small choir of prisoners sang Italian carols, their voices filling the mess hall with bittersweet reminders of home. American guards and staff listened respectfully, some visibly moved despite the language barrier. This is the true power of America, Giuseppe told Paolo as they watched the scene. Not just their factories or their wealth, but this capacity to see enemies as humans, to allow us dignity even in defeat. This is what makes them truly dangerous. Not just their ability to build planes and tanks, but their belief in a kind of decency that transcends the immediate needs of war. Paolo nodded, understanding the profound truth in the older man's words. The stakes and the heated barracks were impressive, yes, but it was the underlying attitude, the casual assumption that prisoners deserved humane treatment, that warfare had limits, that enemies remained people, that truly separated America from the powers they had allied with. That night, as the camp grew quiet under a blanket of fresh snow, Paolo lay awake thinking about home, about the war, about the strange twist of fate that had brought him to this place of relative comfort and safety, while his homeland descended further into chaos and suffering. The guilty relief of his situation mixed with concern for family and friends left behind, creating a complex emotional landscape that defied simple resolution. What would he tell them when the war ended and he returned home? How could he explain the America he had discovered? Not the corrupt, chaotic nation of propaganda, but this place of order, abundance, and unexpected humanity. Would they believe him, or would his experiences seem like fantastic tales to those who had endured years of hardship? The questions had no immediate answers, but Paolo understood that he had been granted something beyond physical comfort. He had been given a glimpse of truth, a perspective that cut through propaganda and revealed a more complex reality than the simple narratives of fascist ideology had allowed. That knowledge, whatever its complications and contradictions, was perhaps the most valuable thing he would carry home from his captivity. As 1944 turned to 1945 and news filtered through of Allied advances across Europe, the Italian prisoners watched and waited, their daily lives continuing in the strange bubble of the camp. The stakes kept coming, the barracks remained warm, the guards maintained their professional but not cruel oversight. And in this unlikely setting, far from the battlefields where they had fought, these men found themselves confronting not only the material reality of American prosperity, but the deeper questions of what it meant for the world they would return to once peace finally came. For they had discovered that wars are fought not only with weapons, but with systems of production, of organization, of belief. And in that broader conflict, they had glimpsed the true measure of American power. Not merely its capacity to produce abundance, but its ability to maintain humanity even amid the brutal necessities of global war. And that realization, more than any meal or comfort, would be the lasting legacy of their time as prisoners in a land they had been taught to hate, but found impossible not to respect. As we explore these hidden moments of history, these unexpected encounters between supposed enemies, perhaps we too might discover perspectives that complicate our understanding of conflict and reveal the common humanity that persists even in humanity's darkest hours.